The year was 1887, and in the high, lonely country of Wyoming, silence was a currency Arthur Vance had accrued in abundance. It settled in the dust on his mantelpiece, pooled in the corners of his one-room cabin, and echoed in the vast, wind-scoured space between his heartbeats. His ranch was a scratch of life on an enormous, indifferent canvas of sagebrush and sky, a place where a man could disappear into his own thoughts for days on end. For 10 years, since Eleanor had been laid to rest in the frozen ground of a brutal winter, Arthur had cultivated this solitude. It was a penance and a refuge, a quiet acknowledgement of the emptiness in his life, a space that should have been filled with the laughter and cries of a child he could never have. His days were a metronome of hard labor, dictated by the sun and the needs of his small herd of cattle. He rose before dawn, the chill of the floorboards a familiar shock to his bare feet. He broke ice in the water trough, his breath pluming white in the thin air. He mended fences that the wind perpetually tried to reclaim, his hands calloused and capable. He spoke more to his horse, a stoic grey gelding named Boulder, than he did to any human soul in a given week. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, and the silence would press in, thick and heavy as a blanket. It was a life of resignation, a long, slow surrender to the quiet grief that had hollowed him out from the inside. He carried the memory of Eleanor's sorrow like a stone in his pocket, its weight a constant, familiar pressure. Her desperate wish for a child, and his body's stark refusal to grant it, had been the unspoken tragedy of their marriage. After she was gone, the silence she had fought so hard to fill with life became his only companion. He was a capable man, a respected rancher in the sparse community of Providence Gulch, but he was also a ghost haunting the edges of his own existence, a man defined not by what he had, but by what he had irrevocably lost. The journey into Providence Gulch was one he made only when necessity demanded it. The town was a clutch of wooden buildings huddled against the elements, a place of hard-bitten people who measured worth in acres and resilience. Their judgments were as swift and sharp as a winter wind. It was on one such trip for flour and salt that the routine of his life was fractured beyond repair. He had tied Boulder outside the general store when he heard the commotion spilling out from the small building that served as Dr. Hale's office and infirmary. A knot of townsfolk stood in the dusty street, their voices a low, troubled murmur. Martha Blackwood, the banker's wife, and the self-appointed arbiter of town morality, stood with her arms crossed, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. Reverend Miller was there, his expression somber and officious, stroking his beard as he contemplated the problem before him. Arthur's instinct was to turn away, to collect his supplies and retreat to the familiar silence of his ranch. He had no taste for town gossip or public spectacle. But then he heard a sound that cut through the murmur of adult voices. It was a thin, reedy cry, a desperate, mewling sound of new life, so faint it was nearly lost on the wind. It was followed by another, and then, impossibly, a third. The sounds snagged something deep inside Arthur, a chord of forgotten longing that vibrated with a painful, startling intensity. Against his better judgment, he moved closer, his boots scuffing in the dirt. "It's a tragedy, of course," Martha Blackwood was saying, her voice carrying clearly. "But what's to be done? The woman was a stranger, no family to speak of, and leaving behind this burden." Reverend Miller nodded gravely. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, but the practicalities are ours to solve. The orphanage in Cheyenne is a week's journey. No wet nurse in this town will take on 3. It is an impossible situation." Dr. Hale appeared in the doorway, looking a decade older than he had a week ago. His face was etched with exhaustion, his shoulders slumped. "She's gone," he said, his voice raw. "Did everything I could. Her heart just gave out. But the babies, they're alive." Arthur found himself pushing through the small crowd, his own volition seeming to abandon him. He stepped into the dim, antiseptic-smelling room. On a cot in the corner lay the still form of a young woman he'd only ever seen from a distance, her face pale and peaceful in death. But his eyes were drawn to a makeshift cradle, a wooden crate lined with blankets, from which the three thin cries emanated. He looked inside. Three tiny, red-faced infants lay tangled together, their miniature fists flailing, their mouths opening and closing like hungry birds. They were impossibly small, fragile beings, their collective life force, a flickering, desperate flame in the vast indifference of the world. They were the children of Rose Callahan, the woman who had arrived in town 6 months prior, already with child and without a husband, earning the immediate and unshakable suspicion of the community. She had kept to herself, her belly swelling as the town whispered behind their hands. Now, her story had ended, and theirs had just begun. "No one wants them," Dr. Hale said, the statement flat and devoid of judgment, a simple, brutal fact. "The Reverend speaks of the orphanage, but they won't survive the journey, Arthur. You know the state of that road. They'll be dead before they see Laramie." Arthur stared at the three infants. He saw their vulnerability, their utter helplessness. He saw the town's cold practicality, their desire to tidy away this inconvenient, messy consequence of a life they had not approved of. In their cries, he did not hear a burden. He heard the deafening echo of the silence in his own cabin. He heard the sound of the life Eleanor had so desperately craved. He thought of the empty cradle tucked away in his loft, a relic of a hope long since buried. The townsfolk were still debating outside, their voices a drone of pragmatism and piety. They spoke of charity and logistics, of who should bear the cost, of how unfortunate it all was. They spoke of the babies as if they were a spoiled crop or a lame horse, a problem to be disposed of. A resolve, hard and clear as quartz, formed in Arthur's chest. It was not a thought, not a plan, but a certainty that rose from the deepest, most barren part of him. He had been a bystander in his own life for a decade, no more. He turned to face the doctor, his own voice sounding foreign and distant to his ears. "I'll take them," Arthur Vance said. The murmuring outside ceased. Every head turned. Dr. Hale stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. Martha Blackwood's eyes widened in disbelief, her disapproval momentarily eclipsed by sheer shock. "Arthur," the doctor began, his voice cautious, "do you understand what you're saying? This isn't a stray calf. This is 3 newborn infants. It's a lifetime." "I know what it is," Arthur said, his gaze unwavering as he looked back at the crate. He felt the weight of their collective stare, the palpable disbelief, the silent judgment. A bachelor. A man known for his solitude, his quiet grief. A man who, as the whole town knew from the sad, whispered story of his marriage, was unable to father children of his own. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth, but it did not change the conviction settling in his bones. "Get them bundled up," he said to the stunned doctor. "I'm taking them home." The silence of Arthur's cabin was shattered. It was ripped apart, shredded, and replaced by a cacophony of wailing that seemed to have no beginning and no end. The first 48 hours were a descent into a special kind of hell, a chaotic blur of desperation and exhaustion. Arthur, a man who could calm a spooked horse with a touch and a word, who could build a sturdy fence and track a lost steer for miles, was utterly and completely overwhelmed by 3 creatures who collectively weighed less than a sack of flour. He had returned to his ranch with the triplets bundled in a crate in the back of his wagon, their cries the soundtrack to the most terrifying journey of his life. He had followed Dr. Hale's hasty instructions, his mind reeling. Goat's milk, watered down and sweetened with a touch of molasses. Keep them warm, keep them clean. The words sounded simple enough in the doctor's office, but in the stark reality of his cabin, they were an insurmountable mountain of tasks. The feeding was a disaster. He tried to use a strip of clean linen dipped in the warm, milky mixture, but the babies either choked and sputtered or refused it altogether, their tiny faces screwing up in frustration as they wailed with hunger. More milk ended up on their swaddling and on his shirt than in their bellies. He felt a rising panic, a leaden sense of failure. He had made a grand, foolish gesture in town, and now, in the unforgiving privacy of his home, he was going to watch these children starve. Sleep became a forgotten luxury. When one infant finally cried itself into an exhausted slumber, another would wake, its own shrill cry setting off the third. He moved like a zombie between the 3 makeshift cots he had arranged near the hearth, his body aching with a weariness that went deeper than bone. The cabin, once his sanctuary of order and quiet, was now a chaotic mess of soiled linen, spilled milk, and the ever-present, piercing sound of infant misery. He found himself staring at them, these 3 red, squirming strangers, and wondering if he had lost his mind. He was a cowboy, not a nursemaid. What had he been thinking? On the 3rd night, the storm of his failure broke. He was sitting in his chair, a crying baby in each arm, and a 3rd wailing from its cot, the fire burning low. His eyes were gritty with lack of sleep, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. He felt a wave of hopeless despair wash over him. He was not equipped for this. The town had been right. He was a fool. He gently placed the babies back in their cots and walked to the door, stepping out into the biting cold of the night. He leaned against the rough log wall, the frigid air a welcome shock. The stars were a brilliant, indifferent spray across the black sky. For a moment, he let the silence of the prairie wash over him, a painful reminder of the life he had so rashly abandoned. The urge to saddle Boulder and ride away, to ride until the sound of crying was replaced by the whisper of the wind, was immense. But as he stood there, shivering, the sound from the cabin reached him again. It was no longer a sound of anger or demand, but a sound of pure, helpless need. He thought of Eleanor, of the fierce, desperate hope in her eyes every month, followed by the quiet, crushing disappointment. She would have given anything, everything, for the sound that was now driving him to madness. A profound sense of shame settled over him. He had taken on this duty, and he would not fail. He would not. He straightened his shoulders, took a deep breath of the cold air, and walked back inside, closing the door firmly on his own despair. The change was not sudden but gradual, born of necessity and repetition. He learned. He discovered that if he warmed a smooth stone on the hearth and wrapped it in cloth to place near their cots, they slept longer. He learned to fashion a more effective teat from a piece of soft leather, punching a tiny hole that allowed the milk to drip slowly. He learned to distinguish their cries, the sharp, insistent cry of hunger, from the fretful, pained cry of colic, and the lonely, desolate cry that simply wanted to be held. His world, once as wide as the horizon, shrank to the 4 walls of his cabin. The cattle were tended to in a rushed, perfunctory manner. Fences went unmended. His life was now measured in feedings, in the changing of soiled cloths, in the endless, gentle rocking that seemed to be the only thing that brought peace. The silence he had once cherished was now a rare and precious commodity, a brief respite in which he would collapse into his chair, only to be startled awake minutes later by the first stirrings of the next cycle. He began to see them not as a collective entity of need, but as 3 distinct individuals. There were the 2 boys, nearly identical with their tufts of dark hair, but one was placid and calm, while the other was a ball of restless energy, always kicking his legs free of his swaddling. And then there was the girl. She was the smallest, the most fragile, with a cry that was softer than her brother's, but somehow more piercing to Arthur's heart. He watched her constantly, a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest whenever she seemed too quiet or still. He had not named them. It felt too permanent, too presumptuous. They were not his. They were a responsibility, a duty he had claimed in a moment of reckless compassion. To name them felt like claiming a piece of them, a piece of the future he had no right to. For now, he thought of them as first, second, and third, or more often, the calm one, the loud one, and the little girl. Weeks bled into one another. Arthur grew leaner, his face shadowed with a permanent exhaustion, but his hands, once calloused from leather and rope, grew surprisingly gentle. He learned how to cradle a tiny head in the crook of his arm, how to test the temperature of milk on his wrist, how to swaddle a baby into a snug, secure bundle. He would sometimes catch his reflection in the small, cracked mirror by the door, a rough-looking cowboy with a day's worth of stubble, holding a tiny infant to his shoulder and patting its back with a tenderness that felt alien and yet profoundly right. One afternoon, the little girl refused to feed. Her skin was hot to the touch, her breathing shallow and fast. A terrifying, cold dread seized Arthur. This was what he had feared, what Dr. Hale had warned him about. Their fragility was a constant, looming threat. He spent the entire night with her, the two boys sleeping fitfully in their cots. He held her tiny, feverish body against his own bare chest, trying to will his strength, his warmth into her. He talked to her for the first time, his voice a low, hoarse whisper in the quiet cabin. He told her stories of his ranch, of the hawk that nested in the tall cottonwood by the creek, of the way the sun turned the plains to gold at dawn. He told her about Eleanor, about her gentle hands and her love for wildflowers. He whispered promises he had no idea if he could keep, promises of safety, of a good life. He pleaded with her, with God, with the silent, listening night. "Don't you leave," he rasped, his throat tight. "You stay. You hear me? You just stay." Towards dawn, her skin began to feel cooler. Her breathing deepened, evening out into the soft rhythm of sleep. He watched her, his heart pounding with a relief so immense it was physically painful. He gently laid her back in her cot and stood over her, his large frame casting a long shadow in the growing light. The fear he had felt was primal, terrifying, but what followed was something else entirely. It was not duty, it was not responsibility. It was a fierce, savage wave of love, so powerful it buckled his knees. He sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands, and for the first time since Eleanor's funeral, he wept. He wept for the fear, for the relief, for the tiny life he had almost lost, and for the profound, terrifying, and beautiful connection that had just irrevocably taken root in the barren soil of his heart. He looked at the three sleeping infants, their tiny chests rising and falling in unison. They were no longer a burden, or a duty, or a moment of madness. They were his. He knew their names then. The calm, steady boy would be Caleb, the restless, loud one, Isaac, and the little girl, the fighter who had stared down death in his arms, she would be Hannah. Caleb, Isaac, and Hannah Vance. The names felt solid, real. They were the first stones in the foundation of a new life he had never dared to imagine. With the naming of the children, something shifted in Arthur. The grim sense of duty was replaced by a deep-seated purpose. He was no longer just surviving the days. He was building a life, a strange and unlikely family within the four walls of his cabin. His movements took on a new confidence, his exhaustion underscored by a current of contentment. He found a rhythm in the chaos, a quiet joy in the small victories, a chorus of contented gurgles after a successful feeding, the sight of three sleeping heads in a row. The first time Hannah's tiny hand curled reflexively around his calloused finger. His infrequent trips to Providence Gulch became tense, necessary evils. He would leave the children sleeping, his heart in his throat the entire time, racing through his errands with a single-minded focus. The town watched him. He could feel their eyes on his back, see the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly as he passed. He was an object of curiosity and stark disapproval. In their eyes, he was an oddity, a fool who had taken on an unnatural burden. Ada Shaw was the exception. The proprietor of the general store, she was a widow in her 40s with kind eyes that held a hint of her own past sorrows. She had lost her only son to a fever years before, a loss that had softened her rather than hardened her. While others offered him stares, Ada offered him quiet assistance. "They'll need softer wool for blankets, Arthur," she said one day, her voice low as she handed him his sack of flour. "That horsehair stuff you use will scratch their skin raw." She didn't wait for his reply, simply added a bolt of fine, soft flannel to his order. "And this," she added, placing a small tin on the counter. "Goat's milk is fine, but this barley flour boiled with the milk will help them put on weight. My mother swore by it." Arthur, a man unaccustomed to kindness, could only nod his thanks, his throat too tight to speak. He paid for the goods, his gaze fixed on the worn floorboards. "You're a good man, Arthur Vance," she said softly, as if sensing his discomfort. "Don't let them tell you otherwise." Her words were a balm, a small shield against the town's silent judgment. He began to rely on her quiet wisdom, asking her advice on rashes and teething, his questions clipped and gruff, masking his deep gratitude. A fragile friendship formed between them, an unspoken alliance of two lonely souls who understood the landscape of loss. As autumn bled into the pale, sharp light of late fall, the children thrived. They were growing, their faces filling out, their limbs gaining strength. Isaac was the first to roll over, an achievement Arthur celebrated with a rare, wide grin. Caleb developed a deep, rumbling chuckle that could coax a smile from Arthur on even the most weary of days. And Hannah, his fierce little Hannah, would watch him with an unnerving, intelligent gaze, her eyes seeming to hold a wisdom far beyond her months. His cabin transformed. What was once a sparse, masculine space was now softened by the paraphernalia of infancy. Blankets draped over chairs, clean linen airing by the fire, a collection of simple wooden toys he had started carving in the brief moments of evening quiet. He built a large, sturdy cradle, big enough for the three of them to sleep side by side, and the sight of them nestled together filled him with a profound sense of peace. He was no longer a ghost in his own home. He was the center of their tiny universe, and they, in turn, were the anchors that had stopped his soul from drifting away completely. The first snow came early that year, a fine, dusting powder that turned to a thick blanket overnight. Winter in Wyoming was not a season, it was a siege. The wind howled like a grieving animal, and the world outside the cabin windows shrank to a swirling vortex of white. The isolation Arthur had once sought now became a palpable threat. His supplies, carefully stockpiled, began to look meager against the prospect of months of being snowed in. The town's disapproval, once a passive force, now became an active threat. Just before the worst of the snows hit, he received a visit. He saw the buggy approaching from a long way off, a dark speck against the white landscape. It was Reverend Miller and Martha Blackwood. Arthur's jaw tightened. He settled a sleeping Isaac more firmly on his shoulder and opened the door. "Arthur," the Reverend began, his tone dripping with false piety as he stepped into the warm cabin, his eyes immediately beginning their critical sweep of the room. "We came out of Christian concern to see how you were managing." Martha Blackwood's gaze was even more intrusive. It lingered on the drying linen, the stacked firewood, the general, homey clutter of a life being lived. Her lips were pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "It is hardly a suitable environment for infants," she declared, her voice sharp. "A bachelor's cabin. It is improper." "They're warm, they're fed, and they're cared for," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. He refused to be ashamed of the life he was building. He shifted Isaac to his other shoulder, the baby's soft weight a comforting, solid reality against the coldness of their intrusion. "It is not about mere survival, Arthur," Reverend Miller countered. "It is about a proper upbringing, a woman's touch, a stable Christian home. The town council has been discussing this. When the circuit judge makes his rounds in the spring, we feel it is our moral duty to bring this situation to his attention, for the children's sake, of course." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. They would try to take his children. They would use the law, their twisted sense of morality, to tear apart the family he had forged from tragedy and silence. A cold, hard anger, the likes of which Arthur had not felt in years, solidified in his gut. "These children have a home," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. He met the Reverend's gaze, then Martha's, and they saw not the quiet, grieving rancher they thought they knew, but a man they did not recognize, a father. "This is their home, and I am their father. You are not welcome here. Get out." He stood his ground, a colossus of weary defiance. For a moment, they seemed taken aback by his ferocity. Then, gathering their cloaks of self-righteousness, they turned and left, their disapproval trailing behind them like a foul scent. Arthur closed the door, the latch clicking shut with a sound of finality. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the two babies sleeping in the cradle, at the one warm and trusting in his arms. The world had shrunk to this room, to these three small lives. The town, the law, the coming winter, they were all threats massing on the horizon. He was one man against all of it. But as he looked at their peaceful faces, he knew he would not break. He would sooner fight the blizzard with his bare hands than let anyone take them away. The siege had begun. The blizzard hit with the force of a physical blow. For 3 days, the world was nothing but a howling whiteness, an unrelenting assault of wind and snow that shook the very foundations of the cabin. Arthur kept the fire roaring, the comforting scent of pine and wood smoke, a fragile bulwark against the storm's fury. Inside, a new and more terrifying storm was brewing. It started with Caleb, a small, dry cough at first, then a wheezing rattle that seemed to fill his tiny chest. A fever followed, his small body radiating a frightening heat. Arthur's blood ran cold. He recognized the sound, the labored breathing. It was lung fever. He tried all the simple remedies he knew, a steam from a kettle of boiling water, a poultice of mustard and flour on his chest. But the fever only climbed, and the baby's struggles for breath grew more desperate. Caleb's face was pale, his lips tinged with a faint, terrifying blue. Isaac and Hannah seemed to sense the crisis, their usual fussing replaced by a fretful, anxious silence. Arthur held Caleb, his heart constricting with every ragged breath the baby took. The storm outside was a mirror of the tempest of fear inside him. He was losing him. After all his work, all the love that had grown in him, he was going to lose this child to the indifferent cruelty of a winter illness. He knew, with a dreadful certainty, that Caleb would not last the night without Dr. Hale. But the town was an impossible distance away, buried under feet of snow, locked behind the screaming wall of the blizzard. To attempt the journey was madness. To stay was a death sentence. Staring at Caleb's small, struggling form, Arthur felt the choice being made for him. There was no choice. He would not sit here and watch his son die. He worked with frantic, desperate energy. He stoked the fire to a blazing heat, leaving a massive pile of logs beside it. He prepared enough of the watered-down milk to last Isaac and Hannah for a day, placing it in a cool spot by the door. He wrapped them in every blanket he owned, tucking them securely into the large cradle, their eyes wide and watching him with a strange, solemn understanding. Then he prepared for the journey. He swaddled Caleb in layers of wool and flannel, then wrapped him in a heavy oilskin to protect him from the wind and snow. He strapped the tiny, precious bundle to his own chest, ensuring the baby's face was sheltered by the collar of his thick sheepskin coat. He was a small, warm weight against Arthur's frantic heart. He pulled on his heaviest boots, his hat down low, and a scarf wrapped around his face. He whispered a promise to the two babies in the cradle, a promise that he would be back. Then he took a deep breath and opened the cabin door. The wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it against the wall. A blast of ice and snow flooded the room. He fought his way out, pulling the door shut against the storm's immense pressure. The world outside was a churning chaos. Visibility was near zero. The snow was already waist-deep in the drifts, the wind a physical force that threatened to knock him off his feet. He fought his way to the lean-to that served as a stable. Boulder whinnied nervously, his eyes wide in the lantern light. Arthur saddled him with numb, clumsy fingers, whispering words of encouragement to the horse and to himself. Leading the horse out of the stable was a battle. The wind shrieked, tearing at them, blinding them with snow. Arthur mounted, his body a shield for the precious cargo on his chest. He urged Boulder forward, into the white abyss, aiming for the faint memory of the track that led to Providence Gulch. Time ceased to have meaning. It was an endless, brutal struggle against the elements. The cold was a living thing, seeping through his clothes, stealing the feeling from his limbs. The wind was a constant, deafening roar. He kept one hand pressed against the bundle on his chest, feeling for the faint, shallow rise and fall of Caleb's breathing. He talked constantly, his words ripped away by the wind, shouting encouragement to his horse, shouting promises to his son. Boulder was magnificent, a creature of incredible strength and spirit, but the deep snow and the relentless wind were draining him. He stumbled more and more frequently. Arthur could feel the horse's powerful muscles trembling with exhaustion. How long had they been out here? Hours? An eternity? He was losing all sense of direction, navigating by instinct alone. The world was a painful, frozen blur. He began to feel the insidious creep of the cold into his core, a deadly lethargy that promised the sweet relief of sleep. He fought it, shaking his head, stamping his feet in the stirrups. He could not fail. He could not. He pictured Caleb's face, then Isaac's, then Hannah's. He had 3 reasons to live, 3 reasons to keep fighting. They were on the verge of collapse, both man and horse, when Boulder suddenly stopped, his head drooping. Arthur peered through the swirling snow and saw it a faint, flickering yellow light. A lamp in a window. It was the edge of town. They had made it, or almost. A wave of relief, so profound it left him weak, washed over him. But his body, having fought so hard for so long, chose that moment to betray him. As he tried to dismount, his frozen, numb legs gave way. He pitched sideways from the saddle, landing in a deep drift of snow with a heavy thud. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the warm, yellow light, a distant, unreachable star. He lay in the snow, the blizzard raging around him, the life of his son still held tight against his silent chest. The light Arthur had seen was from the window of Dr. Hale's surgery. The old doctor had been returning from a desperate call to a neighboring ranch and was nearly a victim of the blizzard himself when his horse shied violently. In the swinging light of his lantern, he saw a shape half buried in a snowdrift boulder, standing exhausted but loyal over the fallen form of his master. A desperate scramble, a shout that was swallowed by the wind, and Henry Hale was dragging Arthur's semi-conscious body from the snow. It was only when he had him inside, by the warmth of the pot-bellied stove, that he discovered the small oilskin-wrapped bundle strapped to his chest. He unwrapped it with trembling hands to find Caleb, pale and barely breathing but alive. Word spread through the snowbound town like wildfire. Arthur Vance, the strange recluse, had ridden through the heart of the blizzard. For a child, for one of the Callahan orphans. The story defied everything they thought they knew about him. Ada Shaw arrived at the doctor's office within minutes, her face a mixture of terror and resolve. She and the doctor worked tirelessly through the night, a silent, efficient team. They forced warm broth between Arthur's chattering teeth, piling blankets on his shivering frame. They worked on Caleb, creating a tent over his cot to fill with steam from a constantly boiling kettle, rubbing his tiny chest with camphorated oil. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. The blizzard that had isolated them now united them in a shared, anxious vigil. Arthur awoke to the low murmur of voices and the smell of coffee. He was in a warm bed, the doctor's bed, and the storm outside had quieted to a whisper. His first thought, a bolt of pure panic, was for Caleb. He tried to sit up, his muscles screaming in protest. "Easy, Arthur," Dr. Hale's voice said. He appeared at the bedside, looking worn but with a small, tired smile on his face. "Your boy is a fighter, just like his father." He nodded towards a cot near the stove. Ada was sitting beside it, gently rocking it with one hand. Caleb was sleeping, his breathing still shallow, but even and clear. The terrifying rattle was gone. The fever had broken. Tears of relief streamed down Arthur's face, freezing on his chapped skin. He had not failed. He had not lost him. The aftermath of the storm brought a thaw, not just in the weather, but in the heart of Providence Gulch. When Arthur, still weak but resolute, prepared to make the journey back to his ranch and his other 2 children, he did not go alone. A small procession of townsmen, led by the livery owner, had cleared the track to his ranch. They brought supplies, firewood, sacks of potatoes, a freshly baked ham. They offered their help with a kind of gruff, masculine shame, their eyes averted, their words few. They had judged a man, and they had been wrong. Their actions were their apology. Reverend Miller and Martha Blackwood were the last to come. They found Arthur on his porch, holding Hannah, while Isaac and Caleb slept peacefully inside. The Reverend held his hat in his hands, his usual booming confidence gone. "Arthur," he began, his voice uncharacteristically humble. I was mistaken. What you did, it was the act of a true father. The town sees that now. There will be no talk of the circuit judge." Martha Blackwood, for the first time in Arthur's memory, looked uncertain. She held out a bundle. "It's a quilt," she said softly, "for the cradle." It was a peace offering, a surrender. Arthur simply nodded, his gaze saying everything that needed to be said. He had not sought their approval, but its arrival was a quiet, welcome relief. The war was over. Spring arrived, painting the prairie in splashes of green and yellow wildflowers. The air was soft, filled with the promise of new life. The triplets were thriving, growing fat and happy on the love and care that enveloped them. They were sitting up, their babbling filling the cabin with a joyous, nonsensical music that had become the new silence of Arthur's life. He was no longer just a rancher, he was Papa. He was the center of their world, the source of food and comfort, the face that brought a smile to their lips. The hollow spaces inside him had been filled, overflowing with a love so profound it felt like it had always been there, just waiting for a place to land. One warm evening, he sat on his porch step, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Ada Shaw sat with him, a comfortable silence between them. She had become a fixture in their lives, her quiet friendship a steadying presence. Caleb was in her lap, batting at a stray strand of her hair, while Isaac and Hannah played on a blanket at their feet. "You look happy, Arthur," she said, her voice gentle. He looked at the three children, his children, and then at the vast, beautiful land that was their home. He thought of the man he had been, a ghost adrift in a sea of silence and grief. That man was gone. In his place was someone new, someone forged in desperation and sleepless nights, someone defined not by what he had lost, but by the 3 precious lives he had been given. "I am," he said, and the simple truth of the word resonated deep in his soul. The silence was gone forever, replaced by the vibrant, chaotic, beautiful sounds of a family. He had ridden into a storm and emerged into the sunlight, finding his true home, not in a plot of land or a cabin, but in the beating hearts of the 3 children no one had wanted, and who had, in turn, saved him.